Hello everyone and welcome to another Motive tutorial video. So I was looking over the last video on 2D and 3D data, and I wanted to make another video showing some more examples on the differences between 2D and 3D data. So I'm going to use the rigid body intro take, and I'm not going to be doing anything technically new from the rigid body intro tutorial, but I am going to step through some of the processes and kind of go a little bit more in detail on something you should be a bit familiar with. So I'm going to start out with my rigid body intro take. I'm in 2D mode. Go towards the center here. Open my timeline. And this is the take we've been kind of playing around with for the last couple of videos. I'm going to select these markers here, right click, and then create from selected markers. So in the intro to rigid body tutorial video, we could see that this rigid body was created, but in 3D we couldn't see it. We had this definition of a rigid body, but it wasn't tracking with our markers. And this gets into another fundamental difference between 2D and 3D data, and this has to do with labeling. So if you haven't already, go into this little eye icon on the perspective view and make sure that marker labels is checked. So when you select markers, I'm going to actually turn off my tracked rays. So in 2D data, these markers just have numeric identifiers, and there is some history that is saved, but if I scrub the timeline around enough and I come back to it, it's going to have some different identifiers. And this is because everything is being reconstructed on a frame-by-frame basis. I'm sure if you watched the last video, you're well aware of this. But if we get into 3D data, we can see that these markers have labels and they also have trajectories. And we were looking at these in the last video, and these trajectories are just unlabeled. So 3D data has this rigid body here. It has reconstructed markers, but they are not labeled. So that is really what this process of auto-labeling a take is doing. It's taking that reconstructed data and applying labels to it based on the definition of this rigid body. All right, so I'm going to walk you through a little bit odd steps, but follow along as best you can. Start out, make sure that you've removed any assets from your take, and then go to the take and delete 3D data. And we can scrub the timeline so everybody's on the 0 frame. So I'm going to start out by creating a rigid body with Control T. And then I'm going to reconstruct. And this is going through the process of reconstructing the data from the 2D cameras into our three-dimensional points. So you'll notice we're in the same position that we were last time. We have our markers, but they aren't labeled, our unlabeled markers. So let's go back to the 0 frame. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make a selection on the timeline, and then I'm just going to press delete on my keyboard. And I am in 3D data, selected. I'm actually going to select 2 of these markers. You can remove this rigid body so you can see them better. Select 2 of these markers, and then make this selection on the timeline, and then press delete on your keyboard. So what this does is it deletes the data, the actual 3D reconstructed data for those 2 markers. See, they come back right there, and they go away, and they come back. So there's no data for these markers right here. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to activate my rigid body, and we still haven't labeled anything. So these markers still don't have any labels. And I'm going to make sure that I don't have a selection. So if you do have a selection, just click anywhere on the timeline to remove that selection. Start at frame 0, and then I'm going to auto label. Oops. And so now it's labeled these markers, but during this part, the rigid body isn't tracked. You can see here everything's labeled, everything's tracked, and then here it is again. But during this time, this rigid body isn't tracked. So, and if you go into here, you can see that there are still those 2 markers here, but 2 markers is not enough to complete the definition for this rigid body. So these are actually treated like separate trajectories. So I'm actually going to do this same process again somewhere else in the take. I'm going to select these markers. We can scrub to the 0 frame, select these markers, and then go to somewhere a little more active, and then press delete on the keyboard. Actually, I don't want to delete all those markers. Press Ctrl-Z to go backwards. And then I'm going to select a couple of these, doesn't matter which ones, and then press delete. Oops. I don't want to delete my rigid body, just the 2 markers. All right, so you can click anywhere in your volume to see what's going on, but you can see that we have a rigid body moving around, and then it disappears and we're left with just the 2 markers because remember we deleted 2 of those markers. But these 2 markers are actually labeled rigid body 1, marker 1, and marker 3. And that's because we deleted our reconstructed data after we auto-labeled. So the labels are already there. We just deleted some of the reconstructed data for, let's see, these 2 markers over here. So you can see that they're missing from these trajectories. However, these markers still have the labels. So this gets into basically the core of what 3D data is. It is the reconstructed data of these markers, and it is also the labels that we put upon these markers. So just for a little reality check, if we go back to 2D data, we have all our markers, we have the rigid body definition that we had before, because 2D data has all of this information and it's making the 3-dimensional image based on all of this. And it is really independent of anything except for the 2D camera data, where 3D data is initially based upon the 2D data, but we can make changes to it which affects the outcome of the 3D data, but it doesn't do anything to the 2D data because 2D data is based upon the camera data. So keeping that in mind, let's select these markers. Let's be in 3D data, select these markers. We can see the gaps in our trajectories, the gaps right here. And there's a lot of editing that we've done to this take. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to reconstruct and auto-label. And what this does is it's going to basically overwrite everything we've done. It's going to go back to the 2D data, look at the data for these reconstructed markers and the rigid body definition, and it's going to completely reconstruct the 3-dimensional markers and label them as well. So if we reconstruct and auto-label the entire take, it's basically going to give us, reconstruct and auto-label. Oh, sorry. I'm doing this on a selection, actually. So that's another important thing. If you make a selection and then delete 3D data, reconstruct, and auto-label, it's just doing that on the selection. So make sure that nothing is selected so that we reconstruct and auto-label on the entire take. All right, so now you can see we have a complete trajectory, really just an image that's very, very similar to what we had in 2D data. All right, well, that's going to be all for this video. I encourage you to rewatch some of the parts, make sure that all of these steps make sense to you, and then play around with the reconstruct settings, reconstruct an auto label and auto label as well, just to make sure that the differences between 2D and 3D data are really well understood, with trajectories, which are the reconstructed markers and the labels for assets like rigid bodies or skeletons. I hope this video helped you in better understanding 2D and 3D data. It is a very confusing topic in motion capture, but I hope this video cleared up anything that was confusing for you. Thank you guys for watching, and as always, thank you for choosing OptiTrack.